Howdy, I'm Nolan Gray, your friendly neighborhood city planner and the research director here at California YIMBY, and one of the project leads on the Metropolitan Abundance Project. Welcome back to the Abundance Podcast. In this episode, I chat with Stan Oklobodzija. He's an assistant professor of political science at Tulane University and the director of the Center for Public Policy Research at the Murphy Institute. His research focuses on housing policy, specifically how voters conceive of housing markets and how these perceptions influence the policies that local governments pursue. He previously served as research director, yes, in my position. No, they did not fire him to hire me. A pro-housing advocacy group that pushes reform at the state level. Have you heard of those guys? Oklobodzija holds a PhD in political science from the University of California, San Diego, and a master's degree in public policy from the University of Southern California. In this episode, Stan and I are joined by Ned Resnikoff, our policy director. We dive into the politics of housing permitting, why so many people don't believe in supply and demand with housing. We talk a little bit about New Orleans, and we talk about some of the work that's coming up next. As always, if you haven't already, please subscribe, hit the like button, leave us a review. Let us know who you want to hear from. We're eager to continue to serving you excellent material. With that, on to the show. Yeah, no, YIMBY Town was great. Ned, you were saying something?
Oh, no, I was just I was agreeing with you that we would have been absolutely way more responsible if it hadn't been for the time change.
The jet lag that corrupted your moral fibers.
Yeah.
Right. No, I mean, I think it was YIMBY Town was great this year. There were a few pieces about this, kind of opining on this. It had a really strong bipartisan feeling this year, which I think it, like inherently kind of has to, right? It's Texas. You're not going to pass anything unless you get some Republicans on board. But I was impressed by the extent to which that wasn't really an issue for any of the participants,
Yeah, I mean, there was Twitter discourse, right? Like a week ago. I mean, there's always Twitter discourse about something, but the whole bipartisanship of YIMBYism generated some discourse.
Yeah,
it's interesting.
This is something I wanted to pick your brain on because you're a political scientist. It is kind of interesting to me, right? Like I look out at the policy landscape and I try my best to only think about zoning because that really is the only issue that matters. But sometimes I think about other minor issues like abortion or Israel Palestine or blah what have you, minor issues, and they're so intensely partisan. And I wonder, like, why has YIMBY not followed that track? Like, what do you think is going on there?
Yeah, I mean, like, so housing is kind of interesting because, I mean, in the grand scheme of issues, like, it really only starts becoming a thing that, most Americans are thinking about in like the last maybe 2 decades maximum or so. I mean, like, I'm kind of old. I just turned 41 a couple weeks ago, and like I remember the days of a person working at a coffee shop or a bartender could afford a studio in San Francisco with no problem, right? So, you know, um, this sort of crunch of housing scarcity driving up prices like in places that previously didn't have high housing prices, a relatively recent phenomenon, right? So I mean, like it really hasn't imprinted itself into the national political psyche as much as an issue like abortion, which has been hard fought since the 19 like 60s, maybe even 50s, you know? I mean, well, I mean even before that, but like it really became a national issue that acquired like this partisan valence, or gun control or something like that,
So,
right?
so
Like,
your
so I
theory
mean,
here is that like if issues are just around for a long time, they get polarized.
well, not necessarily, right? So I mean, like issues beget interest groups, right? And interest groups map themselves onto a party sort of dynamic, right? A party platform in big quotes. So I mean, like there's this big theory in political science of parties are just actually just networks of interest groups, right? So interest groups kind of come together where there's sort of like similar bedfellows, and the parties are where these interest groups sort of hash things out and figure out like, okay, I'm going to give you a 6 week ban on abortion if you give me the right to buy an AR-15 same day or something like that, right?
Natural
So
pairings of issues, right?
yeah, you're right. You know what I mean? Like it's just, they kind of go together, I guess. Weird. But so yeah, like housing, is just sort of, recently a thing, right? Like groups like California YIMBY have been around for what, like, I don't know, what, 5 years, 6 years now or something like that? Or like SF Barf, the first sort of big YIMBY group, just like, I don't know, came around maybe less or about 10 years ago about, right? So I mean, like this is like
Yeah.
just recently acquiring groups sort of backing it, right? And so, I mean, like, it hasn't really mapped itself onto either party's dynamic as much as other issues have.
Yeah.
And I should note for the record that this is an officially bipartisan podcast because Nolan obviously is a big Ayn Rand devotee,
Hmm.
and then I'm a filthy red. So I mean,
Right.
it's even at the sort of granular podcast level, it's the ideological lines are blurred.
It's good. It's a
Yeah,
big coming together.
I gave a talk in Pittsburgh last week, which was good. I mean, and as with every YIMBY gathering, it's like 95% progressive Democrats. And somebody on the subreddit was like, another Trump supporting California YIMBY coming to make money off of Pittsburgh. And I was like, every aspect of that sentence is fascinating to me. Uh, Trump supporting, right? I don't know who like like are there other California YIMBY people coming, making money? It's just fascinating. But what's interesting to me about the movement is the extent to which like you don't really get discourse like that, like within the movement. Like I think Connor Dowdery mentioned this in his piece, or he mentioned it on Twitter, where he was like, I couldn't really find anyone at YIMBY Town, even like progressive Dems, to be like to whine about the presence of like conservatives or more market oriented people being present. And I'm like, you just don't get that level of discipline in other groups.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's striking the extent to which even parties that are, I mean, even interest groups that are more contained within a particular party or a particular ideological wing can fall apart over the most kind of petty minor issues. I mean, think about all the infighting, and I mean, I don't want to name particular groups, but you can see it on both the right and the left that there's all this kind of out in the open infighting oftentimes in various other movements. And yeah, it doesn't seem to be, despite the broader than usual ideological diversity within YIMBYs, that doesn't really seem to be much of a thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think like part of it is that, we're just sort of a new movement. The pro housing movement is just sort of a new thing, but also like we have this advantage of being just centered on a really, really particular issue, right? I mean, there's not a Republican way of doing parking minimums and a Democratic way of doing setback rules or something like that, right? So I mean, like it forces us, I mean, sometimes to our detriment, right, that we think everything's a housing issue. But it really focuses to keep our eyes on the ball, which I think is good for the movement so far.
Yeah, I think that's it because I was thinking about this like so a lot of YIMBYs I think are also in transit groups, but I've noticed that transit groups do seem to have a much bigger problem with this, and I suspect it's partly because there's a lot of like kind of very different reasons why you might support transit or why you might be in a transit group that leads you in very, very, very different policy directions in a way that I don't think is true of YIMBY advocacy. So like everybody at a YIMBY meeting agrees we want to increase the overall supply of housing. And there's going to be maybe some disagreement on like the details of like how much public subsidy, how much social housing, how much are you allowing like sprawl, horizontal development. But there's no disagreement on like that very core thing of like we want as much new housing being built as possible. And and I wonder if it's like just having that like core shared like this is the specific thing we want to do. So like if I'm like a conservative in one of these meetings and somebody's talking about social housing, like sure, if it gets more units built, that's fine. Whereas like if a more progressive in those meetings is like, well, like more market oriented, like there's this common agreement, right? To where it's like we're not going to pick fights with one another that I think, you just don't see in other groups.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'd like to test out a theory on the resident political scientist here, which is that this also has to do with the sort of structural formation of YIMBY groups and how it differs from a lot of other kind of organizations or political formations that are called movements but aren't necessarily movements in the traditional sense, where you don't actually have these sort of clubs at the local level where people are coming together and bonding over this shared issue. Like a lot of it is much more distributed, online, nonprofit led. And obviously there are a lot of YIMBYs that are inveterate posters, and there's a growing, large and growing nonprofit ecosystem in YIMBY world of which we are a part. But sort of at the base level, you're talking about almost like these kind of social clubs, like people showing up in person to things, people showing up to community meetings, and I think it makes it harder to have those types of really vehement, violent disagreements because you actually like if you're more on the DSA side of things and you're in your local YIMBY chapter with like a couple guys who are more libertarian, like you actually know each other. You're not just threatening to kill each other on Twitter.
I
Nothing
think
wrong
like
with
the
that.
the
Nothing wrong with
yeah,
that.
right. Yeah, that's what makes Twitter fun, right? I think like the IRL aspect of the movement is a real big boon. I mean, Nolan and I talk about this a lot, like back when I used to live in Los Angeles, right? That like one of the important things for this movement, and that's just bringing pro-housing people together around a table over some beers, maybe not necessarily to talk about the minutia of zoning, but just to get people connected, right? And sort of build the social capital that a political movement needs, right? So I mean, yeah, there is a lot of networking done in virtual spaces in the YIMBY movement, right? But I mean, like I think a lot of that is paired with a lot of in-person activism, right? I mean, could we be doing better? Like, could we be meeting IRL more and spending less time in Slack channels and on Twitter? Like, yes, absolutely. Like everyone in the world needs to touch a little bit more grass. But I think, as a pretty young movement, like it's doing well so far, especially in the real epicenters of the movement, places like, like the San Francisco Bay Area or New York City, open New York with that revolving happy hour that they do. Oh, the folks in Denver, I mean, like really sort of kind of came from nowhere very recently and like notched us some really big wins in Colorado over the last couple of years. So, props to them.
Yeah. There's something very refreshingly old school about it. It's like it puts me in mind of the Theta Skocpol book, Diminished
Mhm.
Democracy, where she's talking about, the sort of political function that the local Elks Club used to play, or like the Freemasons or something. Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's a little bit of that function here where it's like we're both creating a social circle, or we're not creating a social circle. Like these social circles are emerging organically and they're building social capital, but they're also kind of aggregating people's political concerns and figuring out how to channel them in a way that's productive.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. The sort of pluralism is really needed for a movement.
I mean, Ned, I think you were the one kind of telling me this story, right? But the origins of unions, right? Like it sort of begins with like working class bars where like people who all work at the same place just go have drinks in the evening, and then they're like, then they start, commiserating and conspiring, and like one particularly charismatic member of that group, like it's like I think we can negotiate, right? And it's like, but because they actually had a strong interpersonal bond, then the activism work becomes much more serious, right? Like I always say
Yeah.
this, like, by the time Open New York had incorporated as a group, like we were all friends. Like we had all been hanging out, like doing walking tours or riding bikes or getting drinks or going to public hearings for a year, right? And so from that core, and then you form a core group that is like motivating. I want to help my friends. I don't want to like respond to the 12th text message from Nancy Pelosi asking for another $25, but like, oh, my buddy Stan messaged me and asked me if I can come to this public hearing. My response to that is like very different. And then it becomes a thing that's a community. It's like attractive to outsiders. Like they want to be a part of something like that. They want to contribute. I mean, to me, it's fulfilling like the two kind of needs that I think a lot of folks have is I want a community, I want friends, I want peers to hang out with, and I want to be doing something that I think enriches my community. And that's that pairing that like I think becomes really, really attractive for people.
Yeah, I mean, it's not quite the origin of unions, but I think the conversation that we were having that you might be thinking of is I was kind of talking about this concept of the Red Saloon, which was this feature of 19th century Chicago and that labor movement, where you had these bars where it was like basically the members of the Chicago industrial proletariat would hang out at these bars, and they would be there because their coworkers were there, their buddies were there. Like they weren't there specifically to necessarily to organize for any particular cause, but it was known like, oh, this is like the longshore workers or the iron workers bar. And as you spend more and more time there, you get kind of acculturated to this idea of, oh yeah, we can band together and demand better working conditions from the bosses at like the meat packing plants, which I think is actually more period and location appropriate than longshore workers meat packing. um, but I do think that that's kind of what I meant when I say like there's something a little bit old school or a little bit of a throwback about YIMBY and the YIMBY happy hours and everything. Like the idea that oh yeah, this stuff is also supposed to be fun, and that the way you need to build deep, thick connections to a social community, which is not something you can do on Reddit or Twitter or Threads, for all the advantages that being on those platforms might afford you.
Hmm. Yeah. Stan, I want to ask you a question here. So we're doing pretty good on this right now, but like, yeah, how do you keep YIMBY this kind of big tent or like what are there lessons of like other long-term movements that have avoided like becoming so heavily partisan polarized? Like, are there lessons there that you think YIMBY advocates could learn?
Well, I mean, I think like, Yimby's track record so far has been pretty good in maintaining this sort of bipartisan appeal. I mean, it's just sort of like a sad fact of divided government in America right now that you're gonna need some people to cross the aisle and band together on these sort of cross-party coalitions in order to get anything passed, right? And I mean, at the federal level, government is so polarized and so divided that, everything is sort of thought of as like zero sum, right? So like a win for the Democrats is a loss for the Republicans. If you're a Republican, you should never do anything that's going to benefit that party, right? And I think at the state level, just sort of given what state legislatures look like in a lot of places, like being less professionalized, people that are sort of more new to politics, like that really isn't as thick as it is in Washington, D.C. Or in places with more professionalized legislatures like California or New York or something like that. So you have a little bit more opportunity for something like Montana to take place, right? So I mean, like, I am a registered Democrat. I don't really care for Greg Gianforte that much, his other policies, but you have to, you just got to hand it to him, right? Like there was some that was a very, very important piece of legislation that he helped shepherd across, along with a lot of other folks in the Montana Republican Party, right? And so it's a net win for the people of Montana and a really great example of what these sort of coalitions can look like going forward, right? So I mean, especially in a lot of states where you see one party sort of like ceding into their numbers not giving them the ability to pass legislation that they might want to, right? Housing especially could be one of those issues where a minority party legislature could band together with with the majority party in order to do something and be able to claim, some efficacy and some credit to their constituents, right? If you look at a state like Colorado, for example, Democrats sort of run Colorado. Colorado is no longer a purple state anymore. It's a solidly blue state, but there's this huge contingent of Republicans in Colorado that represent mostly rural interests, right? The sort of people that don't want that rural land being taken up by sprawl, just to accommodate intransigent blue cities, right? That don't want to build any housing within their borders, right? So I think there's a real natural alliance that could be made.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think it kind of it puts me in mind of something. I think it was maybe John Sides said, the political scientist, about bipartisanship and the sort of somewhat unstable equilibrium we now find ourselves in at the national level, where when every presidential election is relatively close to a coin toss and control of Congress is constantly trading back and forth, there's actually very little incentive for bipartisanship, right? Because if you undermine the majority party and undermine their agenda, that increases the already pretty substantial odds that you could be committee chair next year. But in a state like increasingly Colorado or New York or Montana, where the governor's seat and the legislature are generally going to be controlled by one party, there's actually greater incentive for the minority party to engage in bipartisanship, because that's the only way they can actually deliver tangible benefits to their constituencies. And you saw, I think you saw a little bit more of that during periods where at the national level one party was dominating national politics for substantial periods of time.
I do have to say,
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
mean
so
sorry,
oh yeah,
go on.
Stan, go ahead.
No, so I mean, like, you have to say that sort of dynamics in a state legislature are often kind of different than they are in Congress, right? I mean, Congress is designed specifically to, make it really easy to block legislation, right? I mean, you all had Francis Fukuyama on the podcast, so like, if you've not heard of Vetocracy, just refer back to that podcast for a better description than me just trying to do it off the top of my head. But it's a lot easier in Congress if you're the minority party just to gum up the works of Congress. I mean, how many bills have been passed into this Congress? Like 26 or 27. It's like the least productive Congress in like, I don't know, a while. Um, in a state legislature, often because you have this shorter legislative period, you're part-time or something like that, the incentives are a lot different. So yeah.
Yeah, I got it. I mean, so of course, most of our work at California YIMBY is focused on California. That might surprise you all. Uh, right. But so like, but helping out with folks in states like Arizona or recently Pennsylvania, I mean, I have come to appreciate like, man, divided government is really, really, really bad for policymaking. I mean, we're having this conversation literally the day that Governor Katie Hobbs, Democratic governor, vetoed a what was originally a Republican-led, but has since become a very much bipartisan kind of YIMBY zoning reform package, and just vetoing it, right? Like I think partly because an excessive sort of deference to the League of Cities, which refused to negotiate on that bill, but partly on like, well, okay, like it's okay if there's just a lot of chaos between now and November because I think I'm going to be able to get the legislature back to my side. And I mean, it just makes policy like serious policymaking just so much more difficult, right?
No, definitely. I mean, like, especially with housing, where deficits in housing just sort of compound year after year after year. I mean, I remember like before I really even understood like the YIMBY movement as a thing or like what it entailed, like I was just, a grad student in San Diego listening to the hearing for SB 827 back in 2018, right? And like, it's not the perfect bill. We got to move back. We got to do this. And now it's 6 years later, and think about like what could have been achieved in California, like what the landscape would have looked like in California in terms of displacement, in terms of homelessness, in terms of sprawl, in terms of carbon emissions, if we had just gone ahead and passed that bill 6 years ago. I mean,
Ned and I
like,
probably don't have jobs.
yeah,
Maybe
I
we
mean,
do. I don't know.
we'd all be talking about something else. Like, there's a trillion other problems we need to solve as a society. Like, why are we are stuck on housing? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I do think we're making incredible progress. I would say like this issue to me, the first policy issue that I got really motivated on as an activist was marijuana. And I think I partly started to lose interest in marijuana just because it was like, oh, this is so happening. Like it doesn't really need like a big push and focus. And that was also an issue that like by that point it kind of sort of had like some bipartisan consensus, right? Like things were moving with it. But YIMBY to me had that attraction of like it's not like it's pulling from a broad section of people and it's happening, right? Like I mean, we're talking the Arizona bill is disappointing, but like that's a I think the an unusual exception to like otherwise a track record of like these things are happening really really fast, right? Like I was joking the other day I had to turn off my Google AdWord for I think minimum lot sizes or something because it was just I so constantly am getting hits on it, right? That like so many places are having this conversation that it's almost like not even unique. You don't have to seek out the place that's performing on some of these rules, which is cool, I guess. Um, you were the former research director for California MB.
It
You
was.
they fired you to hire me. I was totally
Hmm.
ridiculous. But I'm happy it happened, right?
It's okay. We drew straws, and I came up short, so had to go back to academia.
Yeah, in all seriousness though, I we've never had this conversation, but I'm curious to hear your experience. Like what was that like? Did you change your mind on anything during that period, having been in a position where it's like you're a researcher like deeply engaged in like the actual policymaking process? Did it how did it you by that point you had a lot of training in political science, but I'm wondering like, yeah, what did you learn? What did you change your mind on?
Oh yeah, it was really interesting. I mean, so I started as the research director at California EMB back in 2020, right? So I was like the first research director when they decided they needed someone to sort of like parse through academic literature and sort of like, apply like quant social science techniques to this movement and to the advocacy that California EMB was doing. So it was really interesting. yeah, I kind of like had my fill of academia at that point a little bit. I was kind of sick of it, and it was the pandemic, so we're all stuck inside. So I decided to kind of like try to turn my hobby into a profession. So yeah, no, it was really, really interesting because I mean, like, there's a real big disconnect, especially like, with social scientists, and especially with political scientists that sort of study policy processes and the legislative process and interest groups and that sort of thing. It's really easy to sort of create these gigantic abstractions of how these things work in your head. And that's sort of like the currency we traded in academia of like one theory to rule them all, right? Even if we're reducing human behavior to just these sort of like impossibly simplistic assumptions. Um, and it was really interesting to like just take that into the actual world of like, well, the League of Cities is against us, or well, the building trades control this veto point. So what do we do about that? It was really, really cool. And like it's really interesting to see also, I think, especially as an academic, it's kind of like a black pill as an academic, to see like the actual currency of research in a lawmaking body, right? Like, I mean, you can get something in the American Economics Journal, like people spend years and years and years just like going through the review process of that. And when something comes out, that's one study. But meanwhile, like some nonprofit makes a pie chart, well, that's another study. So you got one to one. So no one really knows who's right. And that was really sort of interesting, sort of humbling as an academic to see like exactly how seriously our research is taken outside of our stupid little profession. But yeah, no, it was really 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 cool. Like I really really enjoyed my time at California YIMBY. I was really sad to leave. But well, one, like they got, definitely did a little upgrade with the research director and hiring Nolan.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
two, like I think it really has like kind of grounded the research I do now and like the sort of actualities and like the actual sort of, like needs of the housing movement and things that will help really like advance policy rather than just sort of like expand the realm of human knowledge or whatever sort of weirdo thing we talk about in academia.
No, I mean, Stan, to a point you were making, this has been a surprise for me as well, is um the quality of the research that goes into a lot of policymaking, totally shocking. And California is probably on like the far upper end of this issue,
Hmm.
right? Which is like, on the one hand, it's kind of distressing. On the other hand, it's cool because I always tell Yimbys, I'm like, you're a GIS tech, or you're like vaguely quantitatively minded, or you can just crack open a zoning code and like make sense of it. You can be the researcher for your like major American city. Like there might not be other people doing this work, right? Or you can be the one person seriously doing this work in your legislature. So like shocking and distressing, but also like an amazing opportunity.
Yeah, I mean that's like really sort of like one of the big advantages of the movement, right? Like, I mean, just sort of like given how convoluted and how sort of like really unsexy the issue of just zoning and urban planning is, like it attracts a very certain type of person, like a very sort of you know, dedicated kind of like maladjusted sort of nerd, right? And it turns out that that person is just really, really good at like scraping a bunch of data or, just mapping various historic districts across the city or something like that. So, I mean, it's a real sort of like high human capital movement. Very fortunate for us.
I do want to thank all the maladjusted nerds tuning in. We know that you are our listener base, and Stan says that with great affection as a maladjusted nerd, I think.
Yeah, exactly right. I
That's
mean, like, hues without sin, et cetera, et cetera.
I want to ask you, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about an amazing paper that you put together with some co-authors on sort of the weird folk economics of housing. And there are a lot of amazing insights in there, but just to kick off the conversation, it was fascinating to me that people like don't apply kind of basic econ 101 concepts that they apply to like every other aspect of the market that they interact with, like cars, appliances, clothing. Like everyone has this kind of clear understanding of like basic supply and demand, but then housing comes in and it's like everything changes. Uh, why? Why is that?
Well, I mean, the short answer is we don't know, but like we've definitely found that there really just is this sort of mental block that people have when it comes to housing, right? I mean, like, you know, supply and demand econ 101 models are really sort of like a useful abstraction in thinking how markets work. And I mean, there's, like dozens of assumptions that need to hold in order for this econ 101 supply and demand model to actually work and blah, blah, blah. Like all, models are sort of, abstracting away one aspect of reality. But I mean, like, it's a very useful sort of tool for understanding how scarcity drives prices and how high prices incentivize producers to come into a market and produce more things. And I mean, like, if you're going to guess what the price of something in the future is, like knowing how, scarce that product is today is a pretty good starting point for that, right? So, I mean, in our paper, we find people can make these, um, they can like abstract through these sort of like more esoteric goods that they don't necessarily come into contact with. So we ask a question about a new fertilizer that, increases grain production drastically in the near term, right? And I doubt that any of, the 4,000 or many of the 4,000 people we'd surveyed across each of the three surveys, like does a lot of work in grain trading. Like, I don't know, maybe we just, got real lucky and got a bunch of like corn brokers or something like
You
that,
mailed the
but I doubt
survey
it.
out to like Iowa or something. I hope not.
Yeah, right. Maybe, but I mean, like, just when it comes to stuff like green, they can get it. When it comes to stuff like a program to train high school kids to be plumbers, they get that with the effect that has on wages. But when you get to housing, there's just this mental block, right? There's just this something goes off the rails and suddenly homes are not a commodity like other things, right? So I mean, I can personally speculate as to why this is going on, right? I think, we have a lot fewer interactions with the housing market than we do with other markets, right? I mean, like, generally one rents a home and stays there for a year or two or something like that. Or if you buy a home, you stay in there for longer. Maybe people don't really have um, accurate ideas about, housing markets in their area. That's something I'm working on a survey with a researcher now at Colorado State, but going off to Ohio State, Dominic Stetsula. We're going to be surveying people about their beliefs about housing markets and what they think like the median home price in their areas and such, right? So I think just people don't have a lot of experience interacting with this market. Um, there's a lot of sort of biases that enter their thinking, right? So a lot of people will see housing prices going up. They'll see a new apartment building going up in a part of town where prices are going up and sort of, don't really get the temporal association, right? They think the apartment building causes the prices to go up. So it's like, the umbrellas going up cause the rain to come down or something like that, right? Um, which I mean, like, it's like kind of funny for us because we're, steeped in housing markets and housing economics and stuff. But I mean, like, you think about the average person, right? Like, they have so many trillions of demands on their time and their attention, right? Like, are they going to sit through an Evan Mast paper or are they going to read Kate Pennington on fires in San Francisco? I mean, probably not. They got better things to do with their lives. So, I mean, you can sort of excuse people for this, but I think the bigger point of this is that people have these sort of erroneous beliefs about what causes housing prices to go up, and that could have the potential issue of causing them to advocate for policies that are counter to their interest of wanting housing prices to go down. So across the board in our surveys, we found people just overwhelmingly, especially renters, want housing prices to drop in their communities, right? And I mean, homeowners say so too. You could think maybe they're just trying to sound cool, like social desirability bias, but I think like to a certain extent, a lot of homeowners would like to see housing prices drop in their communities. Like housing affordability is something
Can we
they
talk a little bit
care
more
about
about
that.
that?
Yeah,
Because
sure.
I think
Mhm.
like a theory that motivates a lot of like YIMBY interpretation of what's going on is like homeowners are, this is kind of the classic like home voter hypothesis, like simplified. Like homeowners are principally motivated by like maintaining home values. They want home values as high as possible. They're extremely risk averse. But that was a finding, right? And that's pretty consistent too, right? Like you like even homeowners are like, yeah, I'm I broadly want housing to be affordable. What do you think's going on there? Like, is that like economic home voter literature just getting something wrong, or what do you think?
No, I mean, like, so, Bill Fischel's home voter hypothesis is sort of like a theoretical model about how to think about, how home owners, like how that motivates their politics. And there's a lot of empirical research that's been done about how home ownership like motivates more political participation. So Jesse Yoder has a really good paper on that from a couple of years ago. The trio of folks from Boston University have a really great book on that and like a continuing research. So I think that, I mean, there's something to that, right? But I don't think that people are really as precise, or homeowners aren't really as precise with their thinking about housing markets as perhaps the home voter hypothesis theorizes them to be, right? So, I mean, you can easily think of a person in a metro area, like somewhere like Los Angeles or something like that, right? That owns a home on the west side, right? Has a single family home and thinks that apartments are going to ruin it. They're going to turn it into, I don't forget what all the YIMBY or all the NIMBYs used to say, like Abu Dhabi or Manhattan or whatever. Insert
The
city here.
unpopular city of the week, right? Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. So, like they can think maybe that's inappropriate here, but like I would like prices in the LA metro to go down so my kids can live closer and I can see my grandkids more and stuff like that. So they're not really thinking, too precisely about like how these positions may be in conflict, right? I mean, of course, there's also just social desirability bias, right? Like, I mean, it's really hard to get people to admit to, I don't know, questionable beliefs in a survey, right? I mean, because we're humans, we like to be liked. So I think there's a bit of both of that going on.
Reading your paper, it's a little bit disorienting in some ways too. I mean, it's great work, but on the one hand, you have this challenge where, for whatever reason, the YIMBY argument about housing supply and housing prices does not seem to be especially intuitive for the median American voter. But on the other hand, Arizona and Governor Katie Hobbs aside, YIMBYs are winning a lot of political victories, and YIMBYism is genuinely popular. And so I'm trying to disentangle, like, why is YIMBYism popular and growing in popularity with a base of voters that, for the most part, seem to intuitively disagree with the central argument of YIMBY policy?
Yes, I mean, like, I think it really goes to show that, a lot of politics isn't really a sort of mass movement, right? Like, politics is done by a certain sort of privileged society that has, won the human and social capital to engage in politics, that has the resources and the free time to do it, right? And it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Like it's sort of, like how you would expect politics to be done in a democracy. Um, but I don't think there's really an incongruity in seeing a lot of elites, in media and academia and, and just sort of like politically active people getting into this idea, right? Like sort of seeing how land use restrictions result in higher housing prices for people, right? Whereas a mass public doesn't really have very sharp ideas about how housing markets work, right? Just because the issue just isn't very salient to them, right? I mean, it's one thing to be concerned, and one of the things we find in surveys and some follow-up surveys that we're doing to this is that, housing and homelessness are top of mind issues for people. But how do you connect that to single family zoning, right? How do you connect that to height restrictions or, setback rules or whatever, massing rules or anything like that, right? Like there's a lot of intermediary steps, like if you think about sort of like the underpants gnome metaphor, like there's a really big question mark in the middle that you have to fill out before you get from steps 1 to 3.
Yeah, and I mean, the point about it not being especially salient, I think, is an important one, because this is something I sometimes run into, especially where I lived in New York for a number of years, and you talk to people in New York, and the New York media market defines a lot of the national conversation around this stuff. New York City is a real outlier among cities in having a really, really large proportion of renters in its overall population. But most people don't rent. Most people are homeowners. It's kind of weird the cognitive dissonance around that. And I mean, I say that I'm a renter, and I mean, part of the reason why I'm in this is selfishly, like, I want my rent to go down. But
I want my
it's
townhouse, man. I was
yeah,
like,
totally.
yeah, everyone's always accusing Yimbys of self-interest. Yeah, I want a townhouse in
Yeah,
LA. It's not that
I
complicated,
too would like one. Yeah, would be
right?
nice.
I'm curious, given your thoughts on this. I mean, like, so I think this has been probably the path for a lot of Yimby. To the question that Ned was asking, like, it does seem to me that Yimbys sort of made a lot of hay out of elite persuasion, right? Like, everyone's always making fun of Yimbys for spending all day on Twitter, but like, I think there's something probably pretty good about like owning the sandbox where all the journalists and like politicos and staffers hang out all day, and that's clearly mattered a lot. But I do think your work reveals something interesting about like messaging this issue to like normal people, dare I say, right? And like, I'm curious if you've, since the papers come out, if you've thought about that more, or if you would, have suggestions for Yimbys based on like how we know normal people think about housing markets.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things we're actually working on right now, we have a survey in the field, is just actually testing out information messages on people and seeing that what that does to how they update their beliefs about housing, right? So we have, a bunch of various like information treatments. We talk about housing compared to cars. We show them a video from Sightline, for example. And we just want to know like if we sort of like walk people through and hold their hand a little bit about how a housing market works, right? Does that cause them to update their beliefs? Because like one of the things we found is that people don't really have these strongly held beliefs about housing, right? A lot of these beliefs are sort of mutable, right? There's a lot more variation we found in people's responses to questions about housing to, for example, questions about like their partisanship, right? Or other sort of like more like sincerely and closely held beliefs, right? So housing isn't really one of these core identity issues yet, right? That really drive people's politics in the way that like LGBTQ rights are, or the way abortion is, or gun control, or immigration, or just, down the list, right? And as like politics in America does, get more identity based, a lot of those sort of issues are just kind of triggers and like turn people off in one direction or the other. I think housing, still is one of those things that's sort of like more of a less salient issue, right? And as such, there's a lot more room to speak to people and have their minds open about it.
Yeah, still an opportunity to maybe be the first person who's seriously talked to them about the issue,
Mhm.
right? Hmm.
Is the lack of federal action and the just complete lack of productivity of this Congress maybe part of that? I mean, I'm trying to imagine. I mean, the YIMBY Act, which is a bill in the U.S. Senate that's co-sponsored by Democrats and Republicans. I think it's Todd Young from Indiana and Brian Schatz
Mm.
from Hawaii. I mean, that's a bipartisan bill, but I do wonder if there was a really truly big federal push in Congress to do something. At the end of the day, the president who's going to sign it or push for it or oppose it is going to be either a Democrat or a Republican, and you can kind of imagine that this getting polarized very quickly. I wonder if how much of the fact that all of the action is happening at the local and state level is really kind of insulating us from that.
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean, like, most of the action on land use regulation in the United States is local, right? There's sort of just how we set up the big quote police powers of government, right? Like whether that is a good idea, spoiler, I don't think it's a very good idea, but like whether that's a good idea or not is immaterial. That's just sort of the way it is, right? And so there's not really that many levers that the federal government can pull on housing, which is why I think there's a lot less motion there, like in the Congress, than there are in some of these state legislatures. I mean, also partly because, housing activists realize that like what's the thing that all the YIMBYs on Twitter say? State politics gets the good or something, gets the goods or something like that, right? Um, so there's just, naturally more movement in state houses across the country, right? But it was really interesting to see Joe Biden did mention housing a little bit in his State of the Union a couple weeks ago or a week ago or whenever it was. And it's interesting, right? Like so the majority of the policies he proposed were just demand subsidies, right? Um, which is like, it's kind of wild, right? Like, I mean, you think about like going to somewhere with like a famine and handing out food stamps or something, right? Like, it's really not the issue that's causing housing prices to go up. It's not that people don't have enough money. It's that a lot of people are bidding up a very scarce commodity, right? And, you know, we all lived through the pandemic. Remember what toilet paper cost a couple of years ago?
Yeah, I mean, to Ned's question, yeah, I mean, I do wonder about this, right? Like, would it be potentially harmful, right, if like a high-profile federal Democrat or Republican were to like come out hardcore on this issue? Like, would it risk polarizing the issue if Biden in the State of the Union address is like, by the way, you need to get rid of minimum parking requirements?
Yeah, I don't know. It's really interesting. Because you're seeing a lot of like strange bedfellows too, with for example, Greg Abbott, the arch conservative Republican governor of Texas, has recently come out against institutional investors buying up all, quote unquote, all of Texas's properties, right? And I mean, like, this is a trope that, Marxists in California have been banging on for the last couple of years, right? So, I mean, like, it's a really, really weird sort of like little party that they put together on this issue, right? And I think it really just kind of goes to show like the sort of cross-cutting nature of these things. Yeah, I wonder, right? I mean, because I don't, really think that there's going to be a big pivot amongst leftists in like blue states against their sort of like, crusade against institutional investors just because Greg Abbott has jumped onto the issue.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. Um, I want to dive into the Stan Oklobodzija extended universe. Um, your top cited paper, Diagnosing Gender Bias in Image Recognition Systems. I assume there's only one Stan Oklobodzija, right?
That's me. Yeah,
That's you.
yeah,
What's
that
the
was me.
housing connect? Could you explain the housing connection with that particular paper?
I wrote that paper largely in a house that I used to rent, um, a townhouse that I used to rent, actually. No, there's no housing connection, just a paper that I did with some folks from a computational social science conference. It was a lot of fun to write.
Well, okay, that's frustrating. Let's try this again. You've done a lot of work actually on dark money, political donors,
Mhm.
and actually, I was kind of joking on the first question, but I do wonder, like, how that might inform some of your views on housing, right? I mean, I joked about this earlier, but the assumption is always that like, oh, YIMBY's like kind of this dark money thing, right? Like getting all these money from developers, and it's like developers actually in most cities don't seem to actually care or realize that like there's a, and certainly landlords are like actively opposed to kind of what YIMBYs are doing. But yeah, what's the dark money to housing connection?
Yeah, I mean, so like when I got into grad school a while ago, I was really interested in the idea of campaign finance. It was like really interesting to me, having worked a little bit in politics myself, to sort of see how, one can turn gigantic wealth disparities into policy outcomes that perhaps, maybe a majority of voters wouldn't choose if given the option, right? So, like, how does money subvert and corrupt the political process? And it got me into dark money. I mean, like, I started grad school right after the Citizens United decision, right? So this was like right after the 2012 election when political nonprofits spent, hundreds of millions of dollars and in that election, and just that number has been growing exponentially ever since then, right? So it's a really, really interesting aspect of our politics that, a lot of the money that goes into it is just completely untraceable. We just have no idea where that money has come from. No one's paying any reputational costs for it. You can't sort of link any quid to any quo anymore with this. And like, I don't really see any, you know, likelihood of reform given the current Supreme Court and also given the fact that Democrats since 2018 have become the big player in dark money rather than Republicans. They sort of like beat them at their own game. And so, why regulate it now, right? Um, so I've always been really, really interested in interest groups, right? And how interest groups are at once like a really sort of pivotal part of a democracy, right? Like, one person's like nefarious dark money developer shill is another person's like good government advocate, like champion of the people, et cetera, right? So,
We're definitely
um,
the latter, to be clear.
that,
But
yeah, right,
yeah,
right,
of
exactly.
course. Yeah,
It's an
just to be clear.
objective
Yeah.
statement there, right? Yeah. So like, you know, I was interested in the congressional level, right, at the federal level, but I mean, just through my like experience, living in California, doing my doctorate at UC San Diego, right, dealing with that atrocious housing market and like being a lifelong Californian, um, like the idea of where interest groups actually affect people's lives the most started sort of coming to my attention, right? So, a really good book just came out last year by a political scientist from Berkeley named Sarah Anzia, about interest
Fellow,
groups and
academic advisory committee member for the Metropolitan Abundance Project, also a former, a previous guest on the podcast, and my former professor.
oh shoot, yeah, so absolutely, yeah, a lot of connections here. Yeah, so I mean, like her book is just really about like these myriad interest groups that are affecting local government and skewing outcomes in local government, right? And if we think about it, right, like everyone pays attention to presidential politics, right? Everyone turns out for a presidential election, like everyone knows like the various players of the US Senate and stuff. But if you think about it, like how often does the average American interact with the federal government, right? You pay your taxes on April 15th, like maybe you go to a federal park once a year on vacation, but all of your real interactions with government, like the way that government really affects your life is at the local level, right? Like the cop that pulls you over, that's a function of local government, right? Like your housing prices, that's a function of local government. The schools your kids go to, that's another function of local government, right? So if we're really going to study how interest groups affect the material outcomes of Americans, I think we have to look at the local level. And I think what better place than housing?
Yeah, this comes to something that I've been thinking about a fair amount recently, which is, there's sometimes a tendency when we talk about American politics to talk about it as if billionaires are the protagonists of history. And I'm pretty disturbed by wealth inequality in the United States. It's something that in my previous career I spent quite a bit of time reporting on. And I do think that sort of outsized political power of the billionaire class in the United States is a real problem. But political influence operates at different tiers, and it's not so cleanly bifurcated. And so you see this a little bit in the way sometimes people, going back to the folk economics, will talk about investors in property, right? Like when you think of someone who is like a investor in property who's really invested in inflating property values or inflating rents, people think like Graystar, Blackstone. But someone who owns a nice house in an exclusionary neighborhood, who doesn't isn't a billionaire but has maybe like a million and $1.5 million of wealth invested in that house. I mean, they have to some extent the same network of interests there. I mean, it's not one to one, but there is some overlap there. And I think on the local level, that sort of influence is way more salient, right? Because the Koch brothers are meddling in the local politics of some places. I mean, they did that in Phoenix with public transit funding, but they're not doing it in like I don't know, Long Island necessarily. It's Long Island NIMBYs who are doing that.
That's exactly right. I mean, like I think there's a big focus on the top 1% in, when we talk about inequality in the United States, right? And like, yeah, there is, this outsized influence that the top 1% has, but when we really get down to it, right? Like, why do we not have the developed rail systems that European countries have, right? Like, why do we have this persistent school segregation 70 years after Brown v. Board? right? Like, why do we still have these yawning racial wealth gaps? And it points more to the influence of a top 10%, which is a lot more uncomfortable for a lot of people, especially a lot of people that are active in the discourse, because, they grew up in houses that were the top 10%, right? I mean, like, I was a member of the top 15% when I lived in Los Angeles, right? If you looked at my income and my partner's income, and we lived in a crappy one bedroom apartment. Well, it wasn't that crappy. It was an okay. It was a pretty nice one bedroom apartment.
Hey man, you had a
Um,
pool. I
I had a
dream of having
pool.
a pool this
It
time of
was it
year.
was a pretty nice pool. It was a pretty nice pool. Like the apartment itself was kind of crappy, but like the amenities of the building were kind of made up for it. So yeah. But like we were in the top 15%, right? So like a lot of that activism, a lot of that like politicking that creates these roadblocks, right? This guy at Brookings, Richard Reeves, has a book Dream Hoarders, right? Which is sort of about that very phenomenon, right? Like it's people that you wouldn't consider rich. You know what I mean? Like it's people with like, I don't know, two sort of like moderate incomes in a household.
It's lawyers.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Retired lawyers, retired architects, like people who have some like institutional knowledge and a lot of free time. I think actually end up doing a lot of damage. The flip side is when they get activated as YIMBYs, they're like some of our best allies, right?
hmm Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like, there's like this huge wealth dynamic in politics that creates a lot of inequality, right? But there's also a time dynamic, right? So, I mean, you could have an investment banker in New York or something like that that's pulling like 400K a year, right? But that person like lives at their desk. You know what I mean? Like that person hasn't had a meal not hunched over their keyboard in like 5 years, So like, even though they have a lot of money, right? Like that person who has a lot of time to show up to all these meetings, to write letters, to politic, to like knock on doors, like translates into a lot more influence than just money.
So you were in Los Angeles. Let's talk about Los Angeles for a little bit. I know you've thought about the city a lot. I live here. Ned lives in the home of our colonial overlords, our imperial overlords up in the Bay Area. But that's okay. Like we're doing good. Um, how do you feel about LA right now? I'm feeling kind of white pilled after the HLA decision. We're hitting permitting highs for permitting. I mean, LA just seems so incredibly dysfunctional on a lot of margins when I moved here almost, 4 years ago now. But how are you feeling about LA from afar?
What's
Yeah, I
the
mean,
what's the recent decision?
Sorry, so great question. So this was a ballot initiative, HLA, a
mhm,
ballot initiative requiring the city to actually build out the protected bus and bike lanes that had been adopted in its mobility plan. Essentially, the city had adopted this amazing plan to build a lot of bus and bike lanes, but the city was not actually building these when they would repave streets. And so the ballot referendum, which passed overwhelmingly a couple weeks ago, said there's a legal requirement to actually do this now. So now LA will have to build something like 300 bus lanes and 300 miles of bus lanes and 200 miles of bike lanes.
yeah. I mean, that's a really big thing. HLA was like I think one of the most important things to happen in California in the March 5th primaries. Like it was just really sort of an incredibly consequential thing, right? But I mean, it really speaks to a lot of the dysfunction of Los Angeles, right? So I mean, like I was in Los Angeles in 2016 when we all voted for a special sales tax to create money to build homeless supportive housing, right? And we raised something like $1 billion+ as a city to do that, to build tens of thousands of supportive housing units, right? And then I don't know, 6 years later, we built just a tiny fraction of them. I mean, Los Angeles voters will turn out for these incredibly important causes, but unfortunately, we just have this sort of derelict political class, where not we anymore. I don't live in Los Angeles, but you all that live in Los Angeles, like Nolan, really just have this derelict political class that just can't do anything about implementation, right? Just will cave to the loudest local interest groups, will drag their feet, just have to be like brought kicking and screaming into doing just the basics. Like, I mean, Measure HLA is a fantastic measure, and just really like shout out to Streets for All and all the other groups that were promoting that. But like, God, why did they even have to? You know what I mean? Like, why did they have to waste all their energy and money and time on that in a city that has a council of, 14, you know, outward Democrats and one non-partisan who's, I mean, probably a Republican, but will not come out and say that, right? Like, why do we need all that effort just to do something as simple as building bus and bike lanes? And I thought we're against climate change as a Democratic Party.
Yeah, I mean we talked about like this element here of like excessive influence of certain groups, right? And I think it's exactly that is, this, I mean, we've talked about this in the kind of like neighborhood defenders, right? The work by Einstein and co on who shows up at these hearings and what are their attitudes and how do they diverge from the broader community, right? And so, of course, you might go out and do this general plan update where it's like, yeah, actually everybody's really down with bus and bike lanes, but then, oh, we actually proposed to do it, and like three crazy people showed up at the meeting and had a meltdown, right? And until a couple years ago, I would have said like, and maybe this is still true, LA's political culture does seem uniquely dysfunctional. Maybe this is just like proximity bias, like I'm here and I'm watching it and I'm seeing it. But it just seemed like, there's this, it does seem uniquely tough. And we've had issues with corruption scandals related to discretionary zoning, but yeah, I'm sure you've thought about this a lot, but what are like the political and institutional changes that need to happen in a place like Los Angeles to deal with that underlying issue?
Oh man, like where do we even start with the political institutional changes? I mean, but like this is just to say
Urban
though, like
governance
not
broadly. Sorry, I just want to frame it.
sure.
Yeah, yeah.
No, totally, totally. But I mean, it's just to say, like, I was a resident of Los Angeles for like 9 years. Like, all of my friends are still in LA. I still sort of think of LA as home. And I think, like, among American cities, Los Angeles is the city that we as a country most need to get right, because just given the layout of Los Angeles, given like the urban form of Los Angeles, if we can convert a city of Los Angeles to be less automobile reliant, to be a place of housing abundance that people can start, coming to again, right? That it can be sort of like a sanctuary for people trying to flee oppression either within this country or from abroad. If we can do that with that city of Los Angeles, it becomes a beacon to other cities of the world, and especially like given the trials and what we're going to need to do to combat climate change or to mitigate climate change in the coming decades, right? I mean, getting Los Angeles right gives a great example for cities like Lagos and for Bangkok and Sao Paulo and such. So I think like Los Angeles is just really a city that we as a nation should be paying a lot more attention to. And again, like also, recency and availability bias. I'm sure people in Phoenix or San Diego would say, or Houston would say the same thing about their cities. And like, I just went to Houston for the first time. Very cool place, terrific barbecue. Shout out to Houston. Um,
It's in the
but
it's,
yeah,
I think you realize this when you drive from New Orleans to Houston. They're very clearly in the same cultural region, and I never you might think you realize this looking at a map, but they really are like clearly companion cities, right? I don't know what your feeling was.
yeah, I mean, like Houston is like kind of a bizarro New Orleans where like they have a government that like kind of gives a shit, right? Whereas like in New Orleans, just all bets are off. Like, um, if you have electricity, it's a good day in New Orleans. So, you know, but yeah, like the cultures of the city, especially the layout of the city is like it's very, very similar. It's like kind of a Gulf South city.
Hmm.
Oh, well, I was just gonna say like let's talk a little bit about New Orleans, because that's where you reside now. And I mean,
Mhm.
has a very different history from I think a lot of the other places that we tend to talk about on this podcast. I mean, uh the sort of hi- history of segregationist, populist kind of governance throughout its history, but also kind of in some ways one of the original melting pots of the United States. And and then there's the things that have been in the headlines more recently within the past 20 years or so, like Katrina. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what you've kind of noticed there in terms of the way land use and land use patterns show up differently, and what are the sort of housing challenges in New Orleans that are different from a place like California or New York?
That's a really good question, man. That's a really super good question. Yeah. So, I mean, I've been in New Orleans since August of last year. It's a great city, terrific. Like if you've never visited New Orleans, like do yourself a favor, get a plane, come to this city. If you don't have fun here, it's entirely your fault because it's just impossible to not have a good time in New Orleans. I've been having too good of a time. I should probably like, go to like Provo, Utah for a little bit and just chill out and kind of get right with God or something. But no, New Orleans is a really interesting city. Has housing challenges just the same as most other American cities. And a lot of that was due, not to an influx of people, right, or a growth in population as it was in a lot of places, but to a destruction of a lot of the city's housing stock after Katrina in 2005. I think something like 800,000 units across the New Orleans metro were destroyed by Katrina. And, following Katrina, there was destruction of a lot of the city's public housing. So like the Iberville projects, the Lafitte projects, the St. Thomas projects, the Magnolia projects. If you're a Juvenile fan, you know the Magnolia clap. Those were all taken down, and a lot of those residents were forced into places with low cost housing in the region. It's primarily in the eastern part of the city, right? New Orleans East. And just given how American cities usually go, the parts of the city that are primarily Black in New Orleans are the worst parts of the city topographically, right? It's the lowlands of the city that are extremely prone. And a lot of those parts of the city were made even worse by drainage projects and pumping projects from the 1960s to create more sprawl land or more land that for sprawl development, right? And it caused like a big bowl effect in the middle of the city, which is like so a lot of the destruction from Katrina came in that bowl, right? I mean, people think that the flooding in New Orleans came from a hurricane dumping water on the city, but actually, like, the flooding came because the hurricane missed the city, dumped into Lake Pontchartrain, and caused the levees, like the inadequate levees, to fail and fill that part of the city. So, New Orleans right now is a city that's losing a lot of population. Um, and it's sort of like a bifurcated loss of population. There's a lot of people whose home were destroyed in Katrina that weren't given any money for recovery because a lot of that money was tied to the previous value of your home and just sort of given, um, typical segregationist zoning practices. Black people especially were given a lot less money because they had, quote unquote, less valuable homes. So those people are gone, are not part of the city anymore, and are not residents of the city anymore. But a lot of sort of higher SES folks have been leaving the city as well because there's really just anemic job growth here. And there's really not much like bringing people to the city. So that's causing a spike in housing prices in a lot of these sort of how do I put it? Sort of like adjacent areas to the traditionally wealthier parts of the city, right? But New Orleans did segregation a lot differently than California cities do. Just being a southern city, right? So like, I'm from Berkeley, California originally, right? So my hometown invented the infamous kludge of single family zoning to keep Black and Asian people out of the Claremont neighborhood, right? I mean, New Orleans could just do segregation the old-fashioned way, right? New Orleans had um, um, segregationist zoning, right, until Buchanan v. Worley, right? But like being the South, they
Do you
just
want
enforced it.
to
Sorry.
unpack that a little bit? I think a lot of people don't know the history of Buchanan v. Worley, and
Oh,
it's kind of
shoot. Yeah,
shocking.
totally.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, my bad. So, I mean, if we think about the origins of zoning in the United States, right, there's like this history and the story of, people not wanting to put homes near factories or factories near homes, right? But there's also this other sort of parallel track of zoning history in the United States where zoning was specifically to declare like what group of people could live where. So some of the earliest zoning rules in America were in cities like San Francisco that were Chinese exclusion zones, right? Or cities like Modesto or Stockton that had similar rules. Los Angeles had one of these first zoning codes
I think it
to
was I was reading about this the other. I think it was Modesto that actually had the first thing that
Is
is
it really?
generally considered like a early point. I got to do a little bit more research on it, but it was like some 1880 or 1890 code where it was like they were
Yeah.
doing exactly this of like to deal with Chinese residents
Mhm.
to try to exclude them. But yeah,
Right, yeah. So San Francisco had something similar like in the 1880s. So I'm not sure like, who inched each other out first for America's
who
first
was more
segregationist zoning.
racist?
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Who
Well, how
wrote
about
their racism down first? A lot of cities sort of picked up on that and zoned by race, right? So um this culminated in a 1917 decision by the Supreme Court in the case of Buchanan v. Worley, which was about the racially exclusionist zonings of the city of Louisville, Kentucky, I believe it was, right? Um,
I'm from Lexington, so you can beat up on Louisville all day.
yeah, it was a Kentucky city. I wasn't sure whether it was Lexington or Louisville. I'm pretty sure it's Louisville.
Lexington would never
Um,
do anything that, but never mind that we probably did do everything that bad. But yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So, there was a case, actually an NAACP lawyer, Charles Worley, I think his name was, brought this, actually bought a house in the white part of town and then didn't pay the owner because he couldn't legally take possession of the deed because of this restriction. So that predictably caused the owner to sue him, and that case wound its way up to the Supreme Court, who invalidated racially exclusionary zoning in 1917. Now, did that stop racially exclusionary zoning in the United States? Absolutely not. It switched to mostly being enforced through covenants until a later Supreme Court case in 1948 in Shelley v. Kramer.
Well, and
Or
Buchanan is kind of a hilarious case too because it was decided on the basis that this was an abridgment of the rights of white homeowners. So it's like the correct outcome of like, guys, you can't actually do racial zoning. This is messed up, but like decided in the most kind of like ridiculous way. And it's like, okay, means and ends, right? Like, okay, sure, if you want to appeal to whites' property rights to sell to black families, I guess that's fine. But
yeah,
this is the funny, like topsy turvy way of getting there.
no, it's actually weird. I mean, like, because like in Shelley v. Kramer, which overturned state enforcement of racially restrictive covenants, I think like three or four of the Supreme Court justices had to recuse themselves because their homes had racially restrictive covenants on them. So it was like a weird 5-0 or like 4-0 decision of the Supreme Court, which is great institution, United States Supreme Court.
Yeah, well now
Um,
we've innovated where they've realized that they just don't need to ever exclude themselves,
no,
recuse
just
themselves.
don't worry about it, man. It's cool,
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's how
And
a
that's your
government should
second
work.
favorite government institution after the Senate, right, Stan? You're a big Senate guy.
I
Sorry, can we
am,
get
yeah.
let's get back to the New Orleans thing. There's so many little like elements where I want to poke you, but Buchanan v. Worley in New Orleans. So New Orleans has explicitly racial zoning, right? But that gets tossed out.
Right, yeah. And then
Yeah,
so later, it's enforced through racially restrictive covenants and also just, I mean, it's the South, um, you know, in the 1900s, right? So, I mean, things were enforced through unofficial non-state violence, right? I mean, you
yeah,
had
terrorism, right?
paramilitary groups, terrorism, like groups like the Klan, groups like the White Citizens League, et cetera. I mean, New Orleans in 1874 tries to launch a coup against the federal government and fails, but there is a monument built to the former Confederates of that coup that was just taken down in 2017. So, ancient history. But yeah, so New Orleans, it's interesting, like doesn't have the sort of segregationism by zoning that you would see in a California city. Like New Orleans didn't immediately go and downzone itself to be all single family, right? So I live in the uptown neighborhood of New Orleans, right? It's one of the whiter parts of the city. And this part of the city has a lot of sort of what we call missing middle construction, right? Like I live in a fiveplex right now. There's a lot of sort of like smaller plex style apartments with no parking in this neighborhood, right? Because you didn't really have to zone for segregation in this city, or the whites in the city didn't have to zone for segregation. Now, following the passage of the Housing Act in 1968, when like all the legal remedies for explicit segregation were taken away, one of the things that happened to uptown where I live right now, and like a lot of the places near the Mississippi River, which are mostly white, they became historic preservation districts. So I live in a gigantic historic preservation district, which is really cool. in the summer here because you have these really crappy wood leaky windows, and it's impossible to not swelter in these places. Like, would be nice to have like vinyl windows and keep that cool in, but hey, historic charms, right?
Is there something, because the architecture of New Orleans is pretty unique. I mean, it's a stunningly beautiful city, but it's also, in that regard, it's also a little bit different from, it's not the typical kind of built environment that you would see in other major cities that were formerly part of the Jim Crow South. And so I'm curious if there are other factors at play here that have preserved that architecture as opposed to a more like a less walkable, more car oriented central area of a southern city.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the big thing, I mean, the first big thing about New Orleans is New Orleans surrendered really quickly in the Civil War. Like New Orleans did not put up much of a fight, so New Orleans didn't get the torch like cities like Columbia, South Carolina, or Atlanta, or various other places in Sherman's path. So as a result, a lot of the old architecture here, a lot of the old Spanish style was preserved. But another interesting thing about New Orleans and why it really didn't get the bulldozer like a lot of other cities, is that it wasn't really possible to sprawl out of the city until relatively late. Like the drainage technology didn't really exist to start building the sort of exurb white flight communities of the city where they currently exist today until about the mid to late 1960s, I believe, right? So as a result, you didn't have the highway administration just like jamming freeways through the city like you did in places like Cincinnati or something like that, right? I mean, not to say that there isn't, right? Like Louis Armstrong's old neighborhood of Storyville, like the sort of former red light district here in New Orleans, like where jazz was created, is now a stupid freeway interchange. Like they built an elevated highway through this primarily. It's actually kind of like a middle to upper middle class black neighborhood um, in the 1950s that was just completely demolished. And now you have this really stupid freeway that's really loud and awful, kind of bisecting like Treme from Mid City. So yeah, like that's I think, sort of the big reason here. And it's also kind of interesting because, a lot of the affordability challenges of New Orleans have to do with those, now exurb city or, sort of like suburbs and um exurban parts of the metro area enforcing these extremely, extremely strict multifamily housing bans, right? So St. Bernard Parish around here made it illegal to rent to anyone who's not a blood relative, right? So Jefferson Parish had a ban on multifamily housing, which is the next parish over. It's Steve Scalise represents that part of the state. So yeah, there's a lot of those sort of implements going on in the newer parts of the metro.
Well, I feel like New Orleans is also in this difficult situation that so many American cities are in, where it's like they're part of this like broader state that sort of resents the existence of their cities, and so they have this antagonistic relationship with the state that kind of sort of wants them to fail. I don't know if that's true of New Orleans, but I just see that in so many contexts of, yeah, a state that's sort of like almost held hostage by, or a city that's held hostage by a state that like kind of resents their existence.
Yeah, it's that's exactly true of New Orleans, and especially now, given the new governorship, Republican Jeff Landry just took over from a Democrat, like one of the last Southern Democrat, or one of the last Democrats in the Southern United States. Yeah, you could
Yeah,
kind of Southern
important
Democrats.
distinction there.
Yeah, right. Yeah, one of the last Democrats in the United States governor. It's a weird sentence, but anyways, people get it. So, yeah, that's been an issue recently. So, like despite the fact that Orleans Parish and this metro is responsible for most of Louisiana's GDP, there's a lot of attempts from Baton Rouge to sort of like stick state influence here. So there's going to be Louisiana State Patrolmen taking over some police duties in the city, right? And those cases being adjudicated by the state attorney general who's a Republican and not by our local district attorney, who's a Democrat. And Yeah, there's quite a bit. There's quite a bit. Obviously, climate change is a major, major concern for not just New Orleans, but all of southern Louisiana. And we have a governor now who is, skeptical, right? I don't know if that's, strong enough of a term about climate change. So, that state efforts to halt coastal erosion are kind of on hold for right now. A lot of challenges for New Orleans, which is a shame because, like I said, this is a fantastic city full of like really, really awesome people who've like made this really great couple months for me so far.
Well, I think an advantage that New Orleans has, certainly over some California cities, is it still kind of has that alternative that we made illegal. Like it still has this missing middle housing typology. It still has these
Mhm.
mixed use neighborhoods. So I would hope that it's at least a little bit easier to point to something that actually exists and say, "Hey guys, we kind of have this thing that has been made illegal, and we actually really love it. And to the extent we still have it, we like desperately try to preserve it."
Yeah, I mean, the preservation aspect isn't really a challenge here, but the problem and the big, big challenge for New Orleans, I think, is that, just as this city or as climate change ramps up and as, the extreme weather events that we see in this city become more and more severe, we're going to need to move the population centers of this city away from where they are now and closer to the Mississippi River, which is the high ground of the city, and it's the part of the city protected by a river levee, right? So, I mean, like, it's the least flood prone area of the city, right? And as it stands right now, it's illegal to, I mean, build almost anything here, or it's not, maybe if it's not illegal, it's extremely cost prohibitive because of the historic preservation zone, right? So, you know, a lot of the housing challenges of New Orleans could be ameliorated, right? If we concentrated new growth in the part of the city that's best equipped to handle it, right? So the part of the city that's highest resourced, the part of the city that was fares the best against hurricanes and future flooding, right? Um, and frankly, the part of the city where an influx of new wealthy residents isn't going to be as disruptive as one of the poorer, less white parts of the city, right? So a lot of the new construction is being pushed into majority Black, low income of New Orleans, frankly, where you really shouldn't be putting a lot of new people, right? Just given the flood challenges of there, right? So, it's going to take a lot of like attitude adjusting, like it does everywhere. If this city is going to start building to meet demand and to try to tackle displacement and higher housing prices.
What are the local elected officials like in New Orleans? Like, do they kind of get it, or do they not?
I mean, it, it's a panoply of people. You know what I mean? So New Orleans, obviously, majority, I mean, overwhelmingly Democrat city, and there's sort of like a schism in the Democratic Party right now, both at the state level and here in Orleans Parish. Um, so there's like an old guard of Democrat that sort of, made their careers by playing nice with the Republicans that run the state of Louisiana. Um, there's been a lot of backlash against like a newer, more progressive sort of upstart branch of the Democratic Party, led by, for example, my state representative, Mandy Landry, who is, doing incredible things to um, sort of like jumpstart that part of the Louisiana Democratic Party and sort of like make the Louisiana Democratic Party sort of like more of a viable presence in state politics. But
Is
I
everyone
mean,
in politics named Landry?
it's a pretty common Cajun name, apparently. A lot of
Okay.
Landrys, a lot of Thibodeaux. Is the thing I'm learning in my time in Louisiana. They're not all related, the Boudreaux and Thibodeaux. Um, But as far as housing goes, I mean, the big housing issues that have been like dominant in New Orleans politics is one, homelessness, right? Homelessness has been ticking up recently as housing prices increase, right? New Orleans sort of has like that double whammy of being an extremely low income on average city, right? Where average wages here are extremely low, combined with really higher than average housing prices.
Kind of the same
I mean,
situation as Miami, right? I
yeah,
mean,
exactly
yeah,
right. Miami's a really good example of that, right?
it's like this
Um,
good second home place, which is challenged when you're trying to, yeah, deal with housing affordability issues, right?
no, 100%. Yeah. And so, I mean, like that sort of leads into the second big housing issue here in New Orleans, which has been short-term rentals, right? So, you know, the whole Airbnb issue in a lot of places is kind of like a boogeyman that a lot of left NIMBYs bring up, right? For not wanting to permit new housing. I think here in New Orleans, like it might be one of the few places where a surplus of short-term rentals is actually pulling housing off the market in an appreciable manner. I mean, if you look at that inside Airbnb mapper, right? Like there's a quite a sizable chunk of the city's housing inventory, if that short-term rental mapper is, that data is like credible, is being taken up by short-term housing, right? So, I mean, New Orleans is a city of 350,000 people or something like that, that gets 1.4 million visitors a year. So there's a huge influx of people coming in, obviously. Like it rules. Like come to New Orleans, have a good
Well,
time.
and I would assume there's a tension there too, right? Because I'd imagine like a huge chunk of the economy is dependent on tourism, right? And
Hmm.
you want facilities for tourists, but on the other hand, absolutely. I mean, just the scale of Airbnbs or short-term rentals broadly in the city is pretty unusual, pretty
Yeah.
extreme. Yeah.
No, totally, totally. I mean, so like there's like, the sort of obvious issues that you don't want like, a bachelor party showing up on your block once a week on like Wednesday when you got to go to work in the morning. Like that's, obvious, right? But there is also this sort of idea that like a lot of these Airbnbs aren't in the highest resource parts of the city, right? Like a lot of these are in, lower income black neighborhoods that abut popular tourist parts of the city, like Treme, for example, which like abuts the French Quarter, right? It's a real easy walk from Treme into the quarter, right? So a lot of Treme has been turned into, or a lot of those like formerly low income units have been turned into short-term rentals. So there's a recent court decision actually that upheld a ban on short-term rentals in the city, but like in Los Angeles with a lot of things, like it's now up to the city to actually enforce that law, right? And so like, the other half of governance capacity is passing, not just passing policy, but actually implementing that policy. And that's really where the rubber meets the road. And well, it remains to be seen, like if anything can be done about it.
So our New Orleans listeners are probably listening with bated breath right now. What is the zoning reform program for a city like New Orleans that you would suggest?
I mean, it's pretty easy, you should upzone areas like Uptown, right? I mean, if you look at a city like New Orleans that I think is like 55 or 60% black, right? You have these parts of the city that are like 70% white, and it's insane. Like, I mean, if you're just drawing, you know, numbers out of an urn, what is the probability you're going to get something like that? These are the best parts of the city, like I said, right? They're the best situated to withstand extreme weather events, right? And it's absolutely insane that we're not trying to add more density to this part of the city, right? So I mean, like upzone my neighborhood, please upzone my neighborhood. There are a lot of really, really underutilized lots that could be turned into like eight plexes, into 10 plexes, right? Even like buildings that are a bit higher, right? New Orleans has a really, really great urban layout. I mean, the city, is easily navigable. It's all flat, so it's easily navigable by a bike, especially by an e-bike. And there's a lot of potential to run more frequent mass transit if you can get some more density in here. Like the city is famously served by streetcars, right? Like the streetcar named Desire, We still have a streetcar on St. Charles Avenue. You know, uh, it's like an old sort of museum piece, which is like really nice in the, 4 months of the year that the weather is nice, but like is complete garbage in the summer. As you can imagine, right? Someone with no air conditioner. But like, a lot of that, could maybe be like supplemented by bus rapid transit or something like that. Um,
Why don't we jump into a lightning round? These never end up being lightning rounds, but we're gonna sort of hit you with some questions here. Most underrated American city.
oh man. Um, my partner, she's from Kansas City, and I just went, and I'm surprised at how much I love Kansas City every time. The food's good. It's a pretty cool place. People are real nice. So yeah, Kansas City.
Yeah, I'm totally with. I had an amazing time in Kansas City. It's got a lot of good urban fabric, great architecture. The streetcar
Hmm.
is pretty useful. Barbecue, you know.
Yeah.
Uh, but I'd not thought about Kansas City prior to going. And the new airport is amazing.
Oh yeah, super nice. Yeah, shout out to Kansas City. Great place. Go
Yeah.
Chiefs. I guess. I don't know.
Well, the fix was in. So yeah, the Chiefs won. Don't worry. Um, uh, Ned, what do you got?
All right. So since living in New Orleans, you've had plenty of time to taking some local jazz. Give us a recommendation.
Oh man. So many good places. I'm gonna recommend two that are good for different reasons. So there's a bar called Bacchanal out in the Bywater. Primarily a wine bar, though they have cocktails in the upstairs, like traditional bar section. It's a spot that like you go in, you can buy a bottle of wine, they charge you like a corkage on it and stuff, but you go out into this like kind of gravel sort of beer garden looking area, and they have a stage, musicians there all the time, always free, but tip the musicians, like they're working hard for you. Really awesome place, like on a warm afternoon or evening to just hang out, listen to some music, super chill. Very cool place. On the other side of the spectrum is a spot out in, I guess the kind of edge of Treme, called Kermit's Mother-in-Law Lounge, right? So famous New Orleans trumpeter Kermit Ruffins. Um, he has two loves: is playing jazz and barbecuing. There was a bar that was like undergoing some financial difficulties or something like that, so Kermit just bought it. He runs a gigantic barbecue outside where when he's not on the stage, he's grilling up like sausages and ribs and stuff. Tremendously cool guy, tremendously cool place, like extremely awesome jazz energy there. Yeah, like that is very cool.
You lived in downtown LA for a while. What's the best place to get a drink in downtown LA?
Oh man, that's a real good question. And I guess it depends on the drink you'd like. So if you're gonna get cocktails, the Wolves over on Spring Street and maybe like I think Sixth or yeah, Sixth Street and Spring. Great cocktails. Get there early. It gets really crowded. Word to the wise, there's a cool little balcony on the second floor that not a lot of people know about. So if you see a little windy staircase, get your drink, go up there, walk outside. Really cool. So that's for cocktails. If you're into beer, it's not technically downtown, it's kind of Arts District, but Boomtown Brewery is fantastic. Native Sun also, on Grand and Ninth, has a bunch of really good stuff. It's a brewery out of Anaheim. But they also carry a bunch of stuff, including this great brewery in San Diego, Pure Project, one of my favorites. For wine, Propaganda in the Arts District, also some of the best pizza in the city. Yeah, those are my three. Oh shoot, no, Cafe Triste in Chinatown, also great natural wine bar. Excellent spot.
Nice. Yeah,
Favorite
I was hoping you would say the Mermaid, man.
Oh, the
Good
Mermaid is really
good
good.
little cocktail tiki kind of vibe. But yeah, all good recommendations. Sorry.
Not trying
Yes.
to blow up the Mermaid. It's a real small place. I used to live across the street from it. But Mermaid is good. Actually, yeah, no, go to the
Our
Mermaid. They need the
our
business. Go to
dozens
the
of
Mermaid.
listeners will you've ruined it now, Stan. You've done it. It's no longer going to be a dozens of Yimbys tuning in are going to flood it on Friday. So
Yeah, that's true. I don't live there anymore, so yeah, like someone go be the newsstand and spend all your money at the Mermaid.
favorite international city.
I'm extremely partial to Rio de Janeiro. I spent about 6 months there. Really, really like Rio de Janeiro. I think like in a lot of ways, the Zona Sul of Rio could be a vision of like what the coast of Los Angeles could look like. Rio is another city where it's impossible to not have a good time in. Like if you don't have fun in Rio, it's also your fault.
What's the coast look like? Why is it a model for LA?
Oh man, so like the coast number one is extremely transit accessible, right? So there's several metro stops right along Copacabana and Ipanema Beach and Leblon as well. They extended the subway since I've lived there. So it's the beach is like a real like melting pot of the city, right? Because like it's a city park, so people from all over the city are there. Various little like lifeguard posts have different sort of vibes that people sort of go for. So that's like kind of cool as well. But also, I mean, the beach in Rio is just surrounded by high-rise buildings. So there's like a lot of like life and things to do, as you're getting closer to the beach or as you're leaving the beach. Whereas in LA, like there's a gigantic freeway and a surface parking lot, which is kind of a bummer. So yeah, no, super cool spot.
Stan, are you suggesting that beach access is not maximized by having lots of parking next to the beach?
I I think it, like guy standing up at public meeting meme, you should have a train or bus to the beach is better.
Very good. Yeah. Okay. Hot take, controversial take. We might people might be tuning off after you
Mhm.
said that. What TV show should Yimbys watch to understand cities, housing, urban politics, anything?
Oh, this is a really good one. It's kind of an obvious answer, but it's really good, so I'm going to say it anyways. David Simon, about 10 years ago, made a mini series called Show Me a Hero about the
Yeah.
fight to put public housing in Yonkers. I think it's like one of the best things on housing ever made. It's fantastic. Yeah, so Show Me a Hero.
Sorry, I kind of knew the answer to that, but Show Me a Hero is so good that I need every opportunity to like beat Yimbys over the head with it. Like it is. I think you were the one who told me to watch it, actually.
Oh, really? Oh, man.
I think so. And thanks. Oh my gosh. Yeah, amazing.
It's a funny show because even though it's the norm in a lot of places, you don't see very many shows depicting an actual weak mayor system. Like if I remember the show correctly, there's all this back and forth about whether or not they're gonna build this affordable housing. And the mayor is trying to slow down the progress of it. And then the city manager just does it.
Mhm.
Like the mayor's like to a meeting and the city manager just does it. And like, yeah, that's kind of how it would. I mean, obviously that's how it worked in the story that Show Me a Hero is adapted from, but it's how it would work in a lot of other cities too.
No, it's the truth.
You travel a lot, Stan. This is very much not a lightning round question. This is just me like picking your brain. When you travel, I mean, how do you approach learning a new city? Like what do you have like things that you try to do in different cities? Different like, you know, specific things where you're like, okay, I'm gonna do these few things to try to learn an aspect about the city.
Yeah, I mean, like, so, it's really easy to like get online or like ask people and figure out like, you know, five or so can't miss things when you go to the city, right? So if you go to Kansas City, you got to go to Oklahoma Joe's, right? And get the Z-Man brisket sandwich, which is great, right? Like you got to go. Um, but I feel like when so you kind of lay that out, and then like when you get to these places, just talk to people, like everyone is really stoked usually, like that someone is visiting their city, right? And wants to tell you all about their city, So be cool, like sit at a bar somewhere, talk to the people sitting next to you, like, and you're gonna hear a lot about like different things that you should check out next.
Take your headphones off, maybe.
Yeah, interact with your fellow human being. It is fun sometimes.
Unless
Interesting.
you're listening to this podcast, then keep your headphones on.
It's true. That's true.
Um, no, that's fantastic. Favorite fictional city?
Man, that's a really good one. Oh, you know what it would be? It would be Los Angeles and Her in the movie Her.
Oh man, gosh, you understand our listener. They're gonna love this. Yeah, of
Yeah,
course. I was just
I
thinking
know what
about
side
that
the
movie
bread's
this
buttered
morning.
on.
Yeah. Do you want to share your Twitter handle, by the way, while we
That's right, brought to you by Carl's Jr. No joke.
that's such a beautiful movie.
It is.
Uh it's just so nice too to see like a depiction of the future that's showing like here's a social challenge and we're very non-judgmental about it. It's complicated.
Hmm. Also funny that the LA of the future is the Shanghai of today. It's kind of fun.
Yeah. I want to step back a little bit. Another aspect of some of the work you've done that I think probably a lot of folks don't know about is you're a crime reporter, right, in
Yeah,
Sacramento for a little while. Do you want to talk about
that's
that?
right. Yeah, that was my like, well, not my first job out of college, but the job I sort of landed at for the longest after for undergrad. So I got out of college and I wanted to go be a newspaper reporter because, like as an academic now, I really know like the growth industries and like where the money is at, right? Obviously. So
You're just
yeah,
in it for the money, right?
I'm
Absolutely.
just, I'm thinking about typewriter repair next maybe or something like that. Um, no, so like yeah, so I bopped around newspapers around California, but ended up at the Sacramento Bee. And then ended up like about a year after I got there on the night cops desk. So the way the Bee worked back then, we had two crime reporters, right? One was daytime, so like a 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. shift or something like that. And there was a person at night that came in to pick up, ongoing stories from the day, but also like things that had happened right before the paper was about to go to press. So my shift was like it was like 4 to midnight or something like that. Um, and yeah, like it was a lot of just, driving around Sacramento with a police scanner, with a Thomas guide because this was the days before Google Maps. So like flashlight in your mouth, like trying to find, like grid A2 to figure out where to make a turn. And it was really interesting because like it's really sort of like unsupervised reporting environment, right? So like I'd, cover the Capitol and you're dealing with someone's spokesperson, not literally trained with reporters and that sort of thing. But like when you're doing night cops, I mean, you're talking to the sergeant that shows up to a crime scene, or you're banging on the doors and talking to the neighbors and stuff. And you really get to understand and know a city. Um, kind of unfortunately by like seeing it at its worst.
This is just a pitch to listeners to this podcast where if you aren't already, please become a subscriber to your local newspaper. I mean, if you're listening to this podcast, also odds are that you care about local politics and local land use in your city. And so what better way to follow it than to subscribe to the local paper? SACB is still doing great work. I think they're really doing an incredible job. San Francisco Chronicle also seems to actually be doing quite well these days. LA Times, little bit of a tougher thing because their owner just sucks. But
Yeah.
um, but yeah, I mean, wherever you are, I really think that the local news environment is really incredibly important to the work we do, and it's just worth supporting.
It's like 2 beers a month, like
Yeah,
$15. Just do it.
just cancel your Netflix subscription. It's Netflix is just increasingly useless. So just cancel your Netflix subscription and sign up for the Times Picayune or whatever your local paper is.
Great, Ned. Anyone else you want to beat up on while we have you rolling? Uh,
Well, I mean, I don't think we have the time for all of my grievances, but
he's cooking.
yeah.
Okay, yeah. Subscribe to your local paper. I mean, this is very much absolutely tied up with what we do, which is it regularly shocks me. Is like there's so few people paying attention to the stuff we do, right? Like that to me is a big part of my theory of like why Yimbys have been effective is like it's kind of just a lot of normal people paying attention to some of these fights for the first time ever. And they might have been fights that like 40, 50 years ago would have been like intensively covered by like some local journalist who would eventually write an amazing book. And it's like nowadays just like nobody is covering this stuff. Nobody like you have these Yimbys that become very influential because it's like I'm the one who goes to my like planning hearing and tweets about it. And like that was historically a function fulfilled by a journalist, but they've since been laid off and I'm the only one doing it, right? Like that's hugely influential just in terms of like sharing what's going on and then like shaping the narrative, right?
I mean, totally, man. Like my first newspaper jobs, like that's what I was doing. I was sitting in city councils of cities that were like 8,000 people, like 4,000 people in one case, right? And just covering the minutia of city government, right? Like that used to be a paying job, not a very well-paying job, but it was a job that, one could do. And not anymore. Like it's, so a lot of Yimbys are like picking up that slack, and it's good. It would be good if it was a paying a job still, but
This
which
is
is why you
pretty.
should subscribe.
I mean, this is pretty untethered from I think our core interests. But I am curious, like, what would it even look like to revive local media? Like, what's the path there?
So this is like a kind of out there idea, but I really think that the post office should create a newswire. So employ people to do local reporting, just straight down the line local reporting, and run like an AP style newswire. Make it like, Creative Commons or something like that, so everyone can pick it up. It'd be a great thing for American democracy.
We're really turning the post office into the everything app. There's postal banking, there's post office's newswire, there's Nolan's idea about let the post office build housing. It's
This
going to
is
be
in keeping with my far right. I'm the far right Trump
right.
Republican in California YIMBY. I support turning the post office into a massive home builder. It's a classic conservative issue.
It's
Yeah,
going to be like a public sector version of Mitsubishi in South Korea, right? Where it's just like in every industry.
the American Zaibatsu is the post office.
Yeah.
I mean, Ned, I want to hear your thoughts on this, right? Because it does seem like, yeah, just so much attention gets absorbed on national issues where it's like the average reader, stand to a point you were making earlier, the average reader can just do nothing. Like it's almost like you might as well be reading about like a sci-fi, like a political sci-fi novel. Like you can't really do anything about national politics. It's pure like fun consumption. Whereas like if you get more people reading about their local politics, like they can like read, understand a situation, and then act on it and meaningfully shift what happens. And so, like, I don't know, Ned, what do we do? How do we revive local media?
I mean, I think some of it is going to have to come down to trust busting. I mean, the fact that so much of how people access news is mediated by massive platforms with sort of opaque systems for actually delineating what news gets shown to people, and then the fact that there's also an oligopoly in digital advertising. I think you need to attack both those things because right now, I mean, there was actually some good writing about this from Josh Marshall at Talking Points Memo recently. Uh, I mean, their advertising revenue has cratered over the past decade or so, and in part it's because of just like the cartelization of that industry. I mean, I think the other thing is that there's actually a lot of good nonprofit journalism happening at the state and local level, and so shout out to here in California, Cal Matters, which is a nonprofit organization that reports on things at the state level. Berkeley side and Oakland side in the Bay Area have been doing great work, and I think we're seeing some of these smaller, more flexible, oftentimes alternative business model approaches to journalism at the local level. So, I mean, I definitely think those things should be supported. For any listeners in New York, I would say subscribe to The City, subscribe to Hellgate. But at the end of the day, I think it's also just sort of like the really dysfunctional distribution model that has emerged in part because the United States for a long time just gave up on antitrust enforcement.
Got to shout out the Lens here in New Orleans. Give them a subscription too.
So, Stan, what are you working on next? It seems like you're doing a lot more work on this. You've just gone out to Tulane. You're an assistant professor, so you have to be cranking out like one paper a month, right? Uh, what are you working on? What's next on the housing? You've said you've done a little bit of survey work, but I'm curious to hear what you're thinking about now.
Yeah, so with Chris Elmendorf and Clayton All, I'm working on another survey, like I'd mentioned about, informational treatments that can their effectiveness in shifting people's perceptions about housing markets. So, can you cure supply skepticism by teaching people a little bit more about housing markets? We're also looking at the sort of policies that people think would be most effective in ameliorating the housing crisis, right? So, are people right now more in favor when they have an opinion about housing of things like rent control or for liberalizing zoning? What else? Like what I'd mentioned before with Dominic Sitsula. We're looking at how people's perceptions about their current housing markets in the places that they live, and also their willingness to um, let's see, like to liberalize zoning to allow more housing, um, based on different perceptions of who might live there. Whether it's going to be people of their same race, or a different race, people of their same political affiliation or a different political affiliation. So that's something we're putting together right now. So those are the housing related things. I also have another thing that I'm working on with a guy named Chris Whitko at Penn State. Um, it's not about housing, but I think it's something also really important about American politics, and it's about parts of the country that are mostly male right now, because the women have gone on to better opportunities, either to college or to move to more productive metro areas. So, what happens with the political beliefs of people who stay behind in these areas? Something kind of interesting to me, and I think
What
sort of
parts
like
of the
that.
country are male dominated? I don't know
So
anything
there's
about this.
a lot of parts of the former Rust Belt, parts of the Midwest and the Deep South, are, especially when we think about when you look at like prime marriage age, are overwhelmingly male, right? So like given a lot of really well needed and positive advancements in equality between the genders, women have become a majority of college graduates and even professional school graduates right now. Before women pay the childbearing penalty, women earn more generally than men. Um, and, women are doing this in places like New York City or San Francisco or Los Angeles, right? Like these sort of like high productivity metro centers, right? But they're coming from places, around the country and leaving them behind, right? So like a woman that in a previous generation would have stayed in a place, right? And just kind of married the guy from high school, right? Like she's gone and that dude from high school is by himself, right? And so what has that done to people's perceptions about immigrants, for example, or people's perceptions about politics and their what they want to see out of elected officials? That's something we're working on right now.
Yeah, that's super fascinating to me. I'm just popping off. I'm a low info observer on this space. I mean, it seems to me that like this is related to this whole thing of like the loneliness, the rise of loneliness, right? You have a lot of singles. You have a lot of people that don't have any friends. Of course, that's not true of anyone on this call, but they are out there, right? I mean, what's your sort of hunch going into this of like, well, how is it? I I would assume like, yeah, do these folks become more resentful, more like more radical in a certain sense on their views of like throwing out the social order? We know that like young single men are like kind of this like potent source of like radical energy, right?
Yeah, I mean, so, there's a lot of work right now about like boys and young men sort of falling behind recently in like socioeconomic status and even things like life expectancy, right? So like a lot of the new knowledge economy is sort of leaving this group behind. And that has consequences to it, right? There is a huge amount of political instability that's created when someone previously with a high position in society has to go down a rung or two, right? It creates a lot of resentment and a lot of potential for political violence. And I think that's an important thing to acknowledge, to sort of understand better, right? As we see sort of angrier and nastier turn in our politics and an uptick in instances of stochastic terrorism by people like this, right? Like I think it's important to see like the motivator and like the drivers of this phenomenon.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I've been thinking a lot about, and I feel like we could do another 2 hours on it, even though it's somewhat outside the scope of what the Metropolitan Abundance Project
Mm.
focuses on. But I mean, for thousands of years, basically having kind of an excess supply of young men without without any ability to kind of absorb them into the social mainstream, or like into labor capacity or anything like that. Like that's been a massive problem. And I think you can start to see the yeah, you can really see the consequences of that now in the United States. I mean, especially with the sort of breakdown of any sort of I mean, it goes back to the theta scotch pole argument that we were talking about earlier, or bowling alone, just like the absence of even those sort of platonic social institutions that kind of give people's life a social thickness and have some sort of socializing function in the sense of preventing people from spinning out into political radicalism.
That's totally correct. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I wonder though, like, is what do you even do about that, right? I think this is actually somewhat more connected to our work than we're maybe at first considering, right? Like, I think everyone on this call would say it's good, like, we need to let cities be big, massive engines of opportunity, right? Like, let everybody who wants to move to a city move to a city. And that might partly like solve the problem, right? Like, there might be a lot of people who are stuck in these like declining opportunity places, places with a severe gender imbalance where it's like, yeah, if you could just move more guys to like DC, which has like a gender imbalance and more women than men, right? Like, you make some progress on the issue, right? But like, there are always going to be these places that like get kind of left behind. I mean, that's the common view against. I think that's the common argument against like letting cities rip. Is like, well, but then aren't you just going to absorb all the like all of a certain type of person out of these lower opportunity areas, and they're just going to get worse and they're going to get more radical. And then because we have a system in the US where it's like land kind of sort of votes, like we get more dysfunctional national politics. What would you say to somebody who made that argument, Stan?
This is like, this is a problem that like a society, a sort of complex society needs to adjudicate, right? So I mean, it's, one of the problems of having land vote, right? If you have a US Senate where 70% of the population gets 30% of Senate votes, right? Like you're really straining the definitions, or straining the boundaries of what can legitimately be called a democracy. Um, but I mean, to the bigger problem, like, you know, a dynamic economy is going to have shifting winners and losers, right? So, I mean, the first deindustrialization of the United States is the Connecticut River Valley, right? When all of that industry moved into Ohio and to Illinois and Pennsylvania and stuff, right? Just because it was more efficient to do it there and to transport it, right? I mean, the Erie Canal and Chicago kind of ate New Orleans's lunch as a shipping center, right? But places adapt, right? Places search for new comparative advantages, and I think the state um is wise and also, morally has a duty to intervene to aid in this transition. I mean, one of the things that's really difficult, though, I mean, it's sort of easier to abstract it out as an economic issue, right? And I think that's kind of like where most policy should go. But a sense of place is really important for human beings, right? Like a sense of a home and a sense of like a geographic location as having a lot to do with a person's identity is important, right? And people don't abandon it as easily, or as quickly as, our economic models might have them, right? They sort of cling to places, right? There's value in that. So I think, this is something, it's a complex issue for a state to balance and for a state to deal with. And I don't really have an easy answer for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's partly self-resolving, right? Because I mean, this is the story of the US until quite recently, that there were mass migrations of people out of low opportunity areas to high opportunity areas. And as a result of that, you get higher wages in the sending areas, right? Because you just have more labor scarcity, right? So that was why wages went up in the South over so much of the 20th century, is that like poor people, both white and black, were just leaving the region en masse, right? And to the extent that we've stopped that up, we kind of have I think that might potentially be a major factor in like why we're seeing declining reductions in regional inequality, for example.
Yeah, I mean, just the sort of gains for being in a high productivity area now are just so much more than they used to be. I mean, like, I forget, there's a statistic about the average wealth difference between St. Louis and New York City from like 1960 versus today, and it's just like orders of magnitude greater, right? So I mean, there's a lot more returns to being into one of these high productivity areas now, just given the nature of the new economy. And I'm not sure if what the answer is. Like, how does one fix that, right? I mean, how does one make a place like, I don't know, like Appalachia, right, viable, you know?
Hmm.
Um,
Isn't this sort of the theory of the Inflation Reduction Act, though, at least in part, that you're going to cite the major manufacturing centers of the new green economy in some of these areas, and that's how you kind of integrate them into the sort of high productivity, high modernist, world of sophisticated green tech and just the sort of tech world in general.
Yeah, I mean, sure, to a certain extent, but it's kind of really difficult to figure out exactly where these things would go, right? For the most bang for your buck.
Yeah.
It's a difficult problem, you know? That's why we should have government with capacity to solve these difficult problems.
You mentioned the issue of democracy. I mean, I think this is an interesting issue that I'd be curious to hear from you as a political scientist on. Is I look at like urban governance in the US, right? And there are a number of weird features of it. Um, I was just in Pittsburgh giving a talk last week when we record this, and right, like they're close primaries, they're odd year, and then also Pittsburgh is like Pittsburgh proper is a little bit like of a rump state. It covers like maybe like a quarter to a third of the metropolitan region. So like on so many margins, you just have kind of like democratic weirdness, right? Of like the metro area of Pittsburgh is completely fragmented among, I think in the case of Pittsburgh, literally hundreds of jurisdictions. Uh, the odd year thing reduces participation. The closed primary and what is effectively a single party city closes participation. Um, like New York is another extreme example of this. Like just almost nobody participates in the meaningful election, which is the Democratic primary, right? I'm wondering, like, besides like this maybe being a little bit of a concern for us if like we want to believe we live in a democratic society, like, is this a problem for housing policy? Is this a problem for like metropolitan abundance? That like people don't participate? Like, if you get, how does this how do urban politics change if like cities incorporated like maybe their far-flung suburbs and like normal people actually came out to vote for elections?
Yeah, I think like the big issue is less participation and more the fact that, you know, parties in government aren't really able to exercise this power of governance, and voters aren't really able to recognize who is in power, such that when elections come, they can vote them out or give them another term, right? So this is really, really different from like for example, like a parliamentary system, right? Where you know the coalition that's in power, right? And so you kind of see like how are things going, right? And if things are going bad, you know exactly who to blame, right? And the other parties are coming out saying, "Hey, it is these people's faults. Vote for us," right? So you don't really have that in American urban governance, right? So I mean, number one, there's just so many different layers of government in our federalist system that it's almost impossible to figure out like who is to blame for something, right? Like who's to blame for housing scarcity in Los Angeles, right? Like, is it the government of Los Angeles? Is it the LA Board of Supervisors? Well, is it the California Assembly or what about HCD? And it's just like there's just these so many trillions of layers that people just throw up their hands and say, ah, all government is bad, right? And it just kind of creates like this cynicism about governance, right? So people just kind of don't participate, they don't care, right? Like it just, it's just something inevitable that's going to be wrong with the world. Um, so, you know, that sort of more heightened transparency, and I think a move to a more party-based system of urban governance rather than a candidate-centered system of urban governance, right? And more flattened governing structures, right? So that there is one body or one person that people can sort of, vote up or down on would be a lot better for these issues that we're concerned with.
I want to pick on one issue that you raised there. I think one of the classic progressive reforms was let's make local elections nonpartisan. And I don't necessarily know exactly why that happened, but it happened. You go and vote in many US cities, and it's not even clear who's in which party. You've argued actually the opposite, which is that we need more parties in cities. We need like multi-party democracy in cities. What's the case for that? You have a great post on Slow Boring, which is Matt Iglesias' blog, but I want to give you a moment to unpack that a little bit for folks who haven't read it.
Yeah, I mean, so you know, in the city of Los Angeles, everyone is ostensibly a Democrat, right? I mean, even if you are a Republican, you go to extreme lengths to hide the fact that you're a Republican. So like Rick Caruso was a lifelong Republican. He famously deregistered before he went up against Karen Bass 2 years ago. So like candidates or parties become or elections become candidate centric, right? But it's really difficult to find information about candidates, right? Like, what's the difference between like a Democrat like Aaron Peskin in San Francisco, right? Or Dean Preston in San Francisco versus another San Francisco Democrat like Matt Haney, right? Um, you really need to do a lot of research, right? And you need to spend a lot of energy to understand like which positions these candidates have and how they map on to your own positions, right? And it's a lot of work. I mean, just multiply that through the entire list of candidates that the typical person has to go through, right? Parties are a really good shortcut for this because by knowing a candidate's party, you know their position on a variety of issues, right? And, the way politics is right now, these policy positions can map pretty neatly onto various political subfactions, right? So a group that's done this extremely well in urban politics have been leftists and progressives, right? Leftists and progressives are doing extremely well in Los Angeles elections because they throw these progressive labels onto their candidates, right? If ground game endorses a candidate, what this candidate is for on a lot of things, right? So it makes things really easy. It's a great shortcut. And so I think changing the structure of elections to make them more party centric, and there's a lot of ways you can do this. I can get into it if you want to. Would do a lot to reduce the information burden on voters so that you can see that, hey, right now the city of Los Angeles is being governed by, I don't know, let's say like homeowner Democrats, right? And I don't like this, so I'm going to throw in a vote for the socialists, or I'm going to throw in the vote for the pro-housing candidate, or I'm going to throw in a vote for a Republican. I don't know, right? That's a lot easier to do than go figure out like, well, okay, Joe Blow is trying to come down from the state Senate. Well, what kind of votes did Joe Blow make there? Like it's a whole big thing.
So the natural next question then, of course, is how do you build that multi-party system at a local level?
Yeah. So one of the big things you can do is something that progressive reformers tried doing about 100 years ago, and that's multi-member districts, right? So one of the things that happens when you have a single member district, and it's kind of to like, clarify these terms a bit. A single member district is what most American cities have right now. So you have like a geographic chunk of area and one person represents that chunk, right? So I used to live in Los Angeles, Council District 14 is a big chunk of downtown LA and Boyle Heights and El Sereno. Like it's governed by one dude, Kevin De Leon. Now maybe someone different come November, right? Like I live in New Orleans, Council District B right now, so it's this big chunk of area, right? One person represents it. That's not necessarily the way governance is structured across the entire world. And in a lot of countries, more than one person will represent a single geographic area, right? So you can have two people, three people, five people, seven people, all representing one area, right? And it helps a lot, one, because it allows for more niche candidates, right? If you have one candidate per area, the incentive for the parties is to become the biggest tent possible, right? You want to swallow up all these little niche positions, create a giant tent, so you're winning that, plurality of the vote. If you don't have to be the first place winner, right? You can go for like a more niche slice of the vote. And especially in an American city, that makes a lot of sense when you have a lot of ethnic diversity, right? So I used to live in Koreatown in Los Angeles, right? Koreatown is an incredibly diverse place. You have a huge Armenian population, Korean population, naturally given the name, but also Bengali population. You have a bunch of immigrants from Mexico, but also, besides just Mexico, a bunch of immigrants from Oaxaca who speak a different language, several languages, in fact, right? You have immigrants from Central America, just a whole panoply of people that lack representation when there's only one person that's representing the district, right? That also translates to ideological differences, right? So you can have like a pro-renter party, for example, representing renters who may not be the plurality of the district, right, but represent a large chunk. So when you have that many candidates, and these candidates are sort of running more niche positions, the incentive to run on slates to reduce this information burden is increased, right? And so you have more like slate voting, more party list voting, et cetera. And depending on depending on the way you structure this election, you can sort of like incentivize that more or less.
And so you envision these being slates because I think status quo, right? Like I'm a Democrat, good, right? Status quo kind of works for me, right? Like my party completely runs cities. I might not be the Democrats that I like, but I would be concerned of, well, if there's actual genuine multi-party competition, it might dilute the extent to which people identify with my party, which might make them like do weird things when they're voting in like state or federal elections, right?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the average voter at the municipal level like really doesn't gain much utility just by, being represented by all Democrats. Like I certainly, my life was not made demonstrably better by living in a city that is run entirely by Democrats, right? Especially given the extreme heterogeneity between a party, right? So, I think just kind of given like recent trends in politics, like people are looking for these more sort of niche um types of candidates within their, preferred party, right? And just sort of having that slate endorsement. I mean, depending on how you want to do it, you could have like a fusion ballot where someone can be like a YIMBY, comma, Democrat or something like that, or Democratic Socialist, or I don't know, Libertarian Republican or something to that effect, right? There's no need to, I mean, I feel like, it's more of like the ideological orientation is more what matters than like the party label.
Yeah. Um, I I do. I would assume that this would only increase participation, right? I would assume that a lot of people just sit out local elections because they're like, look, what does it really matter? Um, you know, I'm curious. I mean, I wonder, to what extent does like ranked choice vote sort of help you to get at some of this or something I really enjoy. I mean, I lived in New York for a while, and New York is very much like barely a democracy. Uh, right? Like, it's really hard to vote. It's closed primaries, odd year, long lines at the voting booth. I just didn't vote unless I thought like it was actually an election where the vote, the plus side of this is that the vote polls are actually so small that like, you're actually in the universe of like your individual vote might matter. But the downside is like the vast majority of people don't participate. Moving out to California, right? Like now we're living in a context where it's like, great, cool. Like, like I'm voting in a jungle primary. The two top winners are going to go forward. Like these are a relatively small turnout, but like my vote actually does matter, even if I'm not registered for the right party or I forget to show up for the right election. Even if I forget to show up for the primary, there's still going to be a meaningful election in the general. Um, I wonder to what extent, like, do you see that as a slight improvement or no?
Yeah, I mean, like, this all goes to say, like, we should make it as easy and as painless and as costless to vote as possible, right? I think one of the big deficiencies of our Constitution is that there's no affirmative right to vote in the Constitution. So, I mean, I live in Louisiana right now. Like, I voted for governor in, I think, like late September of last year, right? the turnout was something abysmal, like 30% of people. Most of us didn't even know there was an election, right? You have to register ahead of time. You have to present a state ID to vote. It's just a gigantic, it's like a nightmare, right? And so turnout in this state is abysmal, and like someone can win the governorship with I think like 18% of votes cast. It's something appalling like that. So we know in the United States how to make voting easy, and that's through vote by mail, right? There's 8 states, I think, that do it. California being the latest addition to it, right? It's the cheapest way of conducting an election, right? It gives people, the opportunity to vote at their leisure, right? I mean, there's really no argument against it. I mean, except like if you believe in like fairy tales of voter fraud, which is just like absurd. It's just completely absurd on its face. And there's like been like 12 instances of voter fraud over like a 12-year period over like billions of vote cast. Like, I mean, you might as well like be worried about like alien invasions or something like that if you're going to be caring about voter fraud. So, yeah, it's a very low cost fix to make voting easier and to boost turnout. But I think, beyond that, we really should be thinking more in the housing movement and like in the abundance sort of movement generally about our political institutions in the United States, right? Like we have extremely peculiar political institutions compared to the rest of the developed world. And I think, it's no secret why our outcomes are so divergent, especially given the fact that we're such a wealthy, wealthy country. Like Missouri has the same GDP as Denmark, I think, which is crazy if you've ever been to either.
Yeah, I mean, I'm totally in agreement with you that we need to think about governing institutions and urban governance in particular very, very carefully. And I would even go a little bit further than you on the question of having a right to vote, where I believe it's Australia has a compulsory voting model. You actually receive a small fine if you don't vote. And I mean, why not? I think that's a good idea personally, as long as it's also at the same time made very, very easy and convenient to vote. I also think though, in some places, there's also this question of just like the clarity of what you're voting for. And this is where the sort of weak mayor, strong mayor distinction that I alluded to earlier comes in. Not to dwell too much on California, but I think also here, but in other places as well, you have these sort of sprawling ballots where it's like you're voting for, the executive on the mosquito abatement district or whatever, and you're voting on a ballot measure to make some extremely esoteric change to the state constitution. And
Kidney
so
dialysis.
yes, that's the dialysis one is the one that was on my mind as a California resident.
I'm proud to be voting for the YIMBY mosquito abatement officer as opposed to the NIMBY. Yeah.
I'm actually pretty NIMBY on mosquitoes myself, but you do
Mhm.
you, Nolan.
Fair, fair.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that's the other element of you actually there should be a relatively small number of officials that you are actually required to know their positions on in order to make informed decisions. And then also those officials need to be imbued with the authority to actually do things so that you can then judge their performance and decide whether to keep them in next term or vote them out.
I think that's absolutely correct. And I think like, party-based elections can help solve a lot of that information asymmetry.
Interesting. Well, we're going to be thinking a lot more about metropolitan governance. I mean, and a whole issue that we didn't even scratch the surface of is just metropolitan fragmentation, right? Is cities are metropolises are basically unified labor housing markets. They're clearly distinct cultural regions, right? Like you get out into the outer suburbs of New Orleans and people are still rooting for the Saints, right? Um, and yet these regions are covered by hundreds of different governing entities, which I think also makes it confusing for people. It's not really entirely clear that what they're voting on or who runs their city, right? Which is a very strange thing.
Yeah, it's sort of one of the other faults of American federalism, right? So like everyone gets to create their own sort of like endogenous government, right? So, if we think about when the explosion of new cities was, especially in California, right? I mean, not to bring it back to California, but like, California is most of this country, or the plurality of this country. Um, that explosion of new cities came during the era of white flight, right? So, I mean, one of the things you want to do when you create your own city is wall off other people, right? And it creates like these really, really terrible incentives for municipal government that you don't have in more unitary systems, right? Like, I mean, what's the added benefit of incorporating a new city in like France, for example, that has a national zoning code, or Japan, right? And I think like, it's kind of outside of my wheelhouse, but I think like this problem gets even more pernicious when we talk about law enforcement because we have so many overlapping law enforcement jurisdictions in this country with extremely, extremely heterogeneous standards for training and for officer accountability. And it creates a horrendous system that you also, again, don't have in the more unitary states.
Yeah, I think this affects a whole host of different issues. That could be another 3 hour long conversation, but Stan, thanks for coming on. I'm excited to see what work you're doing going forward, and New Orleans is lucky to have you. We miss you here in California, but the moment you left, things started getting a lot better in LA. So I
Mhm.
appreciate you splitting and clearing a path for us.
Well, I had a curse on the city for so long. I figured like it was, about time for me to kind of bring that curse somewhere else. So looking forward to outcomes getting worse in New Orleans. No, no jokes. Yeah, great talking to you guys. It was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and
Thanks for joining
please
Abundance. Yeah.
please lift the curse on Berkeley soon, please. I don't know what we need to do, but
Yeah, I don't know. We'll try, man. We'll try. You guys are building your own bus benches, though. I see Daryl's doing that on Twitter. So shout out to those people, um, doing the Lord's work.
Tactical urbanism. Remember that? Yeah,
Hmm.
we're doing it. All right, Stan Oklobodzija, thanks for joining Abundance, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks, y'all.
all right, good to see you.